Thomas Becket, the son of a merchant from Cheapside, London, had worked his way up to the highest echelons of medieval society. He had become Chancellor of England, closest confidant of the king, and then, in a twist nobody could have predicted, was consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He could have been the most powerful individual in England, primate of the church and right hand of the king. But, for his own reasons, Thomas resigned from the position of Chancellor and committed himself fully to the church. King Henry II, however, was not known for forgiving those he felt had crossed him, and as he recoiled from what he saw as the cruelest betrayal, England held its breath. The rumblings of disagreement between Thomas and Henry could be felt almost immediately. The first 12 months following Thomas's consecration saw their dispute crystallise around a particular issue, one which was, at the time, being fiercely debated across Europe. Around 1140, a monk named Gratian had compiled a collection of older canon laws and papal letters intended to resolve discrepancies between the rulings of successive popes and councils, essentially creating a definitive collection of church law. This work, known as Gratian's Decretals, spurred philosophical discourse which essentially boiled down to the question of authority and justice, and who could impose it, temporal rulers or the church. Thomas had studied Gratian whilst in Bologna and often referred to his decretals in letters. He was deeply interested in the rights and freedoms of the church and how they related to secular authority. John of Salisbury, Thomas's friend, whom he had served alongside under Archbishop Theobald, had spent most of his adult life concerned with the question, and continued to serve in Thomas's household. His magnum opus, Polycraticus, was completed in 1159 and dedicated to Thomas. It is a brazen and radical document that comes down very clearly on the issue of authority. According to John of Salisbury, the crown is subservient to the church, and secular rulers should look to the church as a model for instruction and imitation. He also warned of the danger of tyrannical kings, going so far as to say,
"It is not merely lawful to slay a tyrant, but even right and just."
On a practical level, this manifested in multiple occasions where Thomas personally intervened in a number of secular courts to have the culprits tried in his own ecclesiastical court instead. You see, technically, members of the church were entitled to stand trial before other members of the church, rather than secular authorities. Those in the holy orders were supposed to be granted special status by their calling, and so would not have any violence perpetrated against them, nor should they commit any violence themselves. The problem with this was twofold. First, it meant that church courts had a reputation for leniency, often issuing sentences that were much gentler than their secular counterparts. Second, clerics who committed violent crimes were still protected from violent reprisals. In such circumstances, the king and his supporters argued that the cleric had forfeited their special status and deserved to be tried in a secular court and receive a harsher punishment. Obviously, Thomas disagreed. matters came to a head on the 13th of October 1163. Whilst overseeing the translation of the relics of St. Edward the Confessor, King Henry presented a proposal to the assembled churchmen.
I am very concerned with peace, and greatly distressed on its behalf, which in my kingdom is disturbed by the wickedness of clerks who perpetrate rapine and theft and murder.
The king went on to propose that if such criminous clerks should be found guilty in an ecclesiastical court, they then be handed over to the king's court for final judgment and sentencing. King Henry was a proud man, but he was shrewd, and he was famous for his political savvy. Perhaps he wasn't surprised when Thomas and his assembly rejected the offer out of hand. That was a debate they could have another day. And so Henry proposed an alternative, that the council instead simply acknowledge the traditional rights of the crown. In response, those present agreed that they would do so, saving the rights of the church. Basically, they would only agree on the condition that the supremacy of the church over the crown was also acknowledged. On this point, they would not budge, and Henry was incensed by Thomas's refusal to compromise. He left London in a rage, and perhaps fearing for their own prospects, several bishops later went to the king in the hopes of appeasing him. Thomas, however, remained resolute, and his inflexibility on the matter saw him increasingly isolated. Over the following months, several more meetings took place, and despite the best efforts of intermediaries trying to find a compromise, the relationship between Thomas and Henry only worsened. On one occasion, at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, Thomas rather pointedly asked the king to publicly
condemn forever the abuses of tyrants.
In late January 1164, the king convened a council at Clarendon Palace in Wiltshire. By this point, the two could not be in the same room as each other, and so intermediaries hurried back and forth between their two rooms. Eventually, Thomas agreed to verbally accept the rights of the crown, stating,
"I will keep the customs of the realm in good faith."
Taking this opportunity, Henry had Thomas presented with a charter listing all the king's customs for him to sign and seal, thus endorsing a legally binding agreement, which not only had clauses regarding those criminous clerks discussed earlier, but also one which forbade any clergyman from leaving the realm without the king's permission. Thomas immediately regretted what he had said, and couldn't bring himself to sign the charter, instead leaving Clarendon with what Herbert of Bosham described as,
"He wore an uncharacteristically sad expression."
Perhaps the hope of reconciliation with his old friend had been too enticing, and had led Thomas to say something he knew he didn't mean. Perhaps he didn't realise just what he was agreeing to. Whatever the case, the significance of the unsigned constitutions of Clarendon can't be understated. With the writing down of Henry's customs, the king had pinned his colours to the mast, so to speak. Up until that point, the debate had been theoretical. It had been a question of principles and ideas, but now it was solid. It was physically marked down on parchment. Henry couldn't back down anymore. He couldn't make concessions. Now that the constitutions of Clarendon existed, it was a matter of pride. They couldn't be edited or amended without the king admitting that they were changeable. And if one could be changed, why not more? Why not all of them? The argument now had shifted. The lines had been drawn. either the constitutions of Clarendon would be signed, or they wouldn't. In October 1164, Thomas was summoned to appear before the king at Northampton, with the aim of browbeating him into signing the constitutions. Over the course of several days, multiple charges were laid against Thomas, including misuse of funds while he had been Chancellor and the failure to repay loans. Henry sought to weaponize Thomas's past to win their argument, but Thomas was aware of the lengths the king could go to. As his attempts to rally his fellow bishops to his defence were ignored, and fearing he would be tried and executed, Thomas fled for his life. Disguising himself as a Gilbertine, he went first to Lincolnshire, then south to the coast of Kent. 14 days after fleeing the king, he set sail for Flanders. He would not return to England for 6 years. Henry's only response when he heard the news was foreboding.
We have not finished with this fellow yet.
Thomas's self-imposed exile was not unprecedented at the time. Indeed, he wasn't the first Archbishop of Canterbury to take refuge on the continent. In fact, it was seen as somewhat of an accepted tactic. When tempers were getting too high, a brief exile allowed them to cool, and negotiation to begin. Theobald himself had spent some time away from England in 1148, when he had fallen into King Stephen's bad graces. When Thomas arrived in Flanders, he headed to France, and once there to Soissons to meet up with King Louis VII. The French court was the place to be, it seemed, as Louis was also giving shelter to Pope Alexander III, himself in exile due to a particularly fierce and complicated dispute with the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. Henry, however, did not see it as such, and upon hearing that his former friend had fled to the bosom of his longtime rival across the Channel, he was incensed. In retaliation for this perceived betrayal, the king exiled Thomas's family and household and confiscated all of their property. Some appealed to Henry for clemency, others joined the archbishop in exile, whilst others still sought refuge elsewhere. On the advice of Pope Alexander, Thomas claimed sanctuary at the Cistercian monastery of Pontigny, where he remained for 18 months, writing letters and broadening his network of European friends and allies. Far from clearing the air between Thomas and Henry, the time apart only allowed their disagreement to simmer, bubbling away into resentment and paranoia. In 1166, Thomas caught wind of a conspiracy against him in England and immediately went on the offensive. At the shrine of Vézelay, the home of the relics of Mary Magdalene and one of the most sacred places in Western Christendom, Thomas railed against his opponents, denouncing the still unsigned constitutions of Clarendon and, in a move that shocked many of his own household, excommunicating several of the king's followers. In response, Henry threatened to exile every Cistercian monk in England unless the archbishop leave the sanctuary of Pontigny. This forced Becket away from his refuge, but in November that year, he instead took sanctuary at a Benedictine monastery, the Abbey of Saint-Colombe in Saintes, the same abbey Pope Alexander had been staying in. Thomas remained in exile at the abbey for a further 4 years. Those 4 years, though, were not without incident. Thomas continued his letter writing, but in January 1169, an opportunity for reconciliation presented itself. King Louis and King Henry, along with their courts, arranged to meet at the frontier town of Montmirail, with the intention of concluding formal discussions on several matters and negotiating an agreement, a standard fare for two rival monarchs. However, a few days into the meeting, Thomas appeared before both kings. It was the first time he had seen Henry in person since fleeing Northampton, and perhaps now was finally the time for that animosity to be put aside. Thomas spoke first. Stepping forward, he confessed his willingness to observe all of the English crown's rites.
Saving the rights of the church.
Henry could not contain his anger. They were the same words Thomas had used nearly 6 years ago when the whole ordeal had begun. Thomas made it startlingly clear that his position had not changed, nor would he ever compromise on it. Henry leapt from his seat, spitting insults, and even Louis was shocked, asking,
"My Lord Archbishop, do you wish to be more than a saint?"
Following the meeting, Thomas feared he would be exiled from France as well, and went to speak to Louis, who reportedly broke into tears of guilt over his outburst and promised to support the Archbishop, come what may. What could have been a chance at peace only became more fodder for the argument between Thomas and Henry. The situation finally came to a head in 1170. The event that kicked it all off? A coronation. King Henry II, seeking to avoid a future war of succession and a repeat of the anarchy that had plagued England after his grandfather's death, made the decision to emulate the French tradition of having the next king crowned within the previous one's lifetime. And the idea was that they would be co-rulers, the older king being a steadying hand, guiding the future king and giving them vital experience for the day when they had to rule alone. It didn't always work out this way, but that was the idea. And so King Henry declared that his son, the young Henry, was to be crowned. The question was raised then as to who would preside over the coronation. Thomas was still in France when he heard of the plan, and he knew that it was his ancient right as primate of all England to crown future kings of the realm. Eventually word reached him that the young Henry was to be crowned by the Archbishop of York, none other than Thomas's old colleague and adversary, Roger de Pont-l'Evêque. At once, Thomas leapt into action, asking the Pope to forbid the ceremony and sending letters to England appealing for it to be stopped. All to no avail. On the 14th of June 1170, the young king was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony represented a direct challenge to Thomas's authority and the primacy of Canterbury in England. At this point, the Pope intervened, sending papal commissioners to organise a meeting between Thomas and Henry in the hopes of ending the dispute before it could escalate further. Abashed, the two met at Fréteval, a few miles from their previous meeting at Montmirail. On the 22nd of June, they publicly agreed to reconciliation, with the king promising several concessions and the Archbishop agreeing to return to England. It was an uneasy truce, with Henry pointedly refusing to give Thomas the kiss of peace, the symbolic assurance of safety. Things only became more tense in the following months, as Thomas prepared to leave, but the king's concessions failed to materialise. In a final dramatic move before leaving the continent, Thomas wrote a series of inflammatory letters excommunicating the churchmen that had been involved in the young king's coronation. He set sail with his household for England in late November, after 6 years in exile, and landed on Tuesday, the 1st of December, at Sandwich on the Kentish coast. in less than a month, he would be dead.